sense. I'm going to make a few observations because, as Andrew said, Brett wasn't able to make it yesterday, and then I'll pass over to Brett so you can reflect on some of the proceedings today. I think one of the things I find really interesting about this particular context is that I sense from the ambiance within the audience that there's a great latitude in terms of looking and thinking about work which is incredibly diverse and which offers a whole range of different kinds of perspectives about what documentary may or may not constitute. And I was talking to Martin Parr this morning, and we were talking about photography conferences 20 years ago, which were very much dominated by particular, either say, black agendas or feminist agendas. And in a sense, what I find interesting about now when we think about documentary, we're living at a time where right and left politics no longer exists anymore. And as Owen referred to the miners' strike, and Russell Roberts referred to the miners' strike, and it was an incredibly important time in Britain because it represented, in a way, the death of ideology, I think, in terms of those completely polarised debates between right and left, and the falling of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And I think that ultimately has had a massive impact on what documentary can do. And one of the things that Colin Jacobson said, which I thought was really interesting, was that he pointed out the fact that most of the references that people offered from the podium as to the important images were ones of the decisive moment, or as John Syfe said, the decided moment. But I think what's interesting is at the time that a lot of those pictures were made, image gathering, image processing, image production was so much more simple. Simple being an odd word, but when you look at the last presentation, you think about how the web now is infiltrating the way in which images are reprocessed and regenerated, appropriated, misappropriated. Photography and documentary was, at a particular time, had a much more simple, straightforward, linear historical trajectory. And in that sense, I think that, whether we like it or not, this kind of multiplicity of takes on what documentary can and can't be is inevitable. Whether it's sort of good or bad for the medium or not, I don't think there's any choice. I think technology has ensured that the way, for instance, photography sits in galleries now is takes on a completely different kind of notion of objecthood. And I think probably for me one of the great things about photography now is that the notion of objecthood, of the work of art, photographic work of art, is much more seriously considered and I think technology providing large digital printing and all those kind of developments in terms of scale, they've thrown up a whole new way of thinking about photography. And so much documentary work in black and white traditional form was, I think, accessible through book form, usually in a much better way than actually seeing exhibited in galleries, although my own experience of seeing Ouija prints in reality, there's no substitution. But I think that because of these technological changes, I think we have a new way of thinking about photography, and it just seems now that we also have our sense of what's possible. I think there's a much greater latitude in thinking now. It's much more relaxed. It's less ideological. And maybe one of the other final things I'll say before I pass over to Brett is that one of the things that Russell pointed out this morning, which I think we can't lose sight of, and is that kind of value attached to the image and the authentic image. And I think he has a slight reservation or fear that with images being able to be their authorship being lost and being manipulated in postmodern climate, that we are actually losing any sense of history, because as someone pointed out, quite an interesting expression, talks about filling in the gaps with fictions. I mean, there's a problem with that. There's no question there's a problem with that, but there's also an absolute reality that that's where we are. But I kind of worry as well about the ethics and the photography has become so available to any kind of appropriation and commodification. And I think about the Jeremy Deller Orgreave reworking, and I do worry about if it goes into a gallery, the struggle that those people went through, the very real experiences that those families went through when basically Thatcher shafted full communities and in fact destroyed social cohesion in Britain, I think. I'm wondering about what you're left with when you present that stuff in the White Cube, and I believe the White Cube is a really important space, as Faye was touching on. But I do worry about the implications of taking people's personal experiences and repackaging them in a particular way which might not necessarily lead back to the roots of that struggle. Anyway, that's just some thoughts. I'll pass over to Brett.
Thank you. It's a very good point, because I'm the director of the Photographers Gallery, recently appointed, and of course I'm struggling with all those issues of how best to present photography. Is the White Cube necessarily the right way to keep presenting photography in the 21st century? Today I've been fascinated to hear so many different approaches to this, from one Roberta's fabulous ideas about interceding in newspapers and using other forms of presentation, to more traditional artists such as Faye and Nicholas, who still regard the White Cube as being liberating. And of course, from the other side of the platform, somebody like Owen Logan, who really does have issues with that sort of position for himself in his work. And I think that what Chris has said is entirely true. There's a diversity of views that is being presented today, and they're all in their own way have a position on this wide platform. And I feel that this has really opened up the debate and stimulated in my mind about how we can go forward. Also, publishing in terms of books has become so important for photographers and for practitioners generally. I think at the gallery, one thing I'm very concerned about is going back and looking back at the whole relationship between printed page and photography over the last century. I mean, a lot of the images that came today, mass observation was one example of the printed page being very important. We have many other examples, and now, of course, the World Wide Web is a new form of that. But that form of dissemination is going to become so important. And I think in the future we're going to have to represent that in the things we do at the gallery and elsewhere. Sure, down here at Photo Gallery in Cardiff as well. Other issues that interested me today was the whole idea, of course, the reminder from everybody who spoke to me, who referred to history in some sense, about the idea of photography's ability always to mislead and fictionalize. We have to constantly remind ourselves that this is nothing new. In 1991, I presented a show here at Chapter Art Centre that Chris might remember, called Decomposition, which had Helen Sear in it, had Helen Chadwick in, and a lot of the issues that we're discussing today about the reality and artifice were already current in all that body of work. I'm thinking now that something like Keith Arnott's Objects from a Rubbish Tip could be contextualised in either documentary or fiction. And a lot of the issues that were current 15 years ago are still around today and have been discussed on the platform. I think what I'll do now is I'll open up the discussion to others, because we haven't got very much time, and we do want to have some questions from the audience, especially with regard to the latter papers for today. I expect that some of you are very interested in what Hito has to say, and Verena about the World Wide Web. So if you have any questions, please can you have them to us. But otherwise, can I ask the panel for any comments that they might have on other papers they've heard this afternoon? How about you, one?
Could I just start? I'm fascinated by the piece that Tito showed the last bit. What I find extraordinary, maybe you can talk through this bit, maybe other people find this extraordinary, but this notion of conflating fiction with reality, where the
reality summits, there will be a press coverage which highlights violence and so on, and of course the project is a complicit in this as well. And it was an attempt at least to make visible this whole stage, of the reality which is taken as a given within the news. So basically this is the story of this picture. And of course, she acts as a trigger of a reality, or maybe she doesn't really change this reality, but she tries at least to change our perspective on it, and I think that's maybe the decisive part of this picture.
Peter, did you get it shown on mainstream news? Or did it get any coverage on it?
No, we tried really hard. You know what happened? The journalists always wanted to do an interview with her. What do you really feel? Come on, tell me. Were you throwing stones also? And she didn't want to say it. So she kept showing this panel, so it didn't really work. But of course, this image has been distributed. As a video still, it was reprinted in several video installations, not only this one. So it was distributed. It became visible.
Let's talk about that issue of which I think we haven't actually touched upon a lot, and Ray sort of started to talk about it, and I think also Anne Hardy did, in terms of, well, in particular with Anne, she's coming from a painting background, and the notion of space and three-dimensional space and pushing forward in picture plane is something that's really important. But again, it's that business which I think we have to take on board, that if we believe that the gallery space is worthwhile, and I think it's an extraordinary space, then I think the way that we place those photographic objects in there is really critical to the way in which they're consumed. Someone used the word consumed, talked about it, I thought was brilliant. How that stuff is consumed by the spectator, and the optical relationship that the spectator has with these objects. And I just think that that's something which, for me, has become, I think it's become increasingly, I feel it's becoming increasingly more important within the photographic world that it didn't used to be. And I think ultimately it's something which has to be central really to the way now I think how people want to mediate the pictures in the world through the gallery space.
Just think that I don't know about the history of photography awareness about just in terms of an awareness that, particularly with the photographic process, I guess, where, as someone else mentioned, it's a staged process where you do have to go away and you go as logistically before. Your presentation side of photography, as in those things, is almost a separate step, which is slightly odd. But you certainly need to think of it that way, but that's the point at which the work very theatrically, however naturally you like to pretend it is, that's the point that it theatrically meets its audience. And its audience very theatrically is inviting you into a certain place between certain hours to receive it. I'm saying some really obvious things, but they're important things to remember. It's very conscious of the need to do it. It depends. You can in and out focusing on the process of work, that at some point before you make it, you're kind of aware of how it might work. And then when you're making it, like with that work, you're just aware of the smell of the rabbits and the kids, and that stuff goes out in your head for a bit, and then you become extremely conscious of it. When you suddenly realise you've got to invite other people in on this work, and you've got to step back. But you've still got to be aware that how you're inviting people in and where your relationship with the work dissolves a bit is a completely manipulated situation, and one that you can control to a large extent. And so how you take that on is very important. And equally, the ethical question of what you're doing when you take that on. As you mentioned, what you do when you take those sort of very political situations into an art gallery. I would argue, and possibly just very slightly,
it's a very short time, is that whenever any of those situations are recorded in any way and presented in any way, whether that be mass media or museums or the White Cube, there is an ethical question. The advantage of the White Cube is that it's more likely to be recognised and discussed as an ethical question, whereas in the other media that it could get distributed in, that could well get forgotten, and the sort of charade that is the capturing and the presenting might also get forgotten. So I think I'm very sceptical of the White Cube space, but I think that's where it's most useful, is that it at least encourages this mode of cynicism and questioning.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But I think agitational propaganda is, as we talk about agitprop now, so much stuff which was produced. I mean, think about when camera work was coming out in Britain. I mean, it's an extraordinary magazine because not only were you looking at pictorially really extraordinary images, but they were actually creating agitational propaganda. The stuff they did in Ireland was extraordinary, and it actually added to the debate about bringing about political change. Now, my worry about the Dara stuff in White Cube is that actually it doesn't bring about political change. In fact, it's not, as you said, it's not even trying to bring about political change. I mean, what it does is provide us with a very interesting intellectual conundrum to think about. And Russell's illustration of that, him seeing it in that reenactment thing, I just thought was quite extraordinary.
But it's giving an opportunity to question what it is to try to bring about political change. That's very important.
Chris, can I ask, I should comment on this because it's a very different perspective. As you know, he does believe in the anti-naturalist realist strategy.
I might be sitting on the wrong side of the table. I don't agree there's no left and right. I'd remind everyone here that fewer people go to the 1997 general election in Britain than voted in the first pop idol contest. Less than 50% of the population voted in this elections to the Scottish Assembly. I heard yesterday that 51% in Wales. There is a large section of society that is disenfranchised by globalisation, and the left and right still exist. It probably exists in the dichotomy between the World Economic Forum, who would say that there's no such thing as left and right, and the World Social Forum, which is trying to re-articulate what the left means under globalisation. I've recently reviewed the book Conflicted Powers from the Retort Group for Variant, and they opened up in that book they opened up with this question: were they prepared to hang on to the category of the left? And they did, and they did so for good reasons. Many of the things that Rita was bringing up, they're not technical issues. They're issues of epistemology, philosophy, and politics all rolled into one. And I'm not sure this is the best place to actually deal with these things. I'm not sure that they're actually probably better dealt with in a place like the World Social Forum. But we are here. A lot of us work in institutions or studying them. Like the one I'm going on strike on Tuesday. But I'm going to strike because of wage claim. I don't agree with the teaching unions on the basis of the strike, because one of the things that we are not pursuing in the academy is actually what the marketisation of knowledge and the marketisation of education is doing to our understanding of the world. Sorry, I'll bring this bit to close.
How as a practitioner
Yeah, the question is that for me is that the White Cube space, of course, presents lots of problems, and I think we all have to be very careful about how we deal with it, because it very quickly leads into subjectivism, and you end up in a kind of ideological trap that was actually set up for artists in the after the Second World question about why the sort of culture of communication and our wider role, which people like Juan are pursuing and myself, is that I think we need to really ask ourselves who are our audiences in those situations, and how do we access those audiences, and what are our relationships with those audiences? Because it's not really good enough just to drop things into the web and well, that's accessible, because most of or a large part of humanity is still to make a telephone call. The World Wide Web is actually culture that shares in Western Europe, and predominantly it does expand around the world, of course, but its usage is mainly in the West, inverted commas, and most people's outside of those societies, most people's use of it is very limited because they're in internet cafes and paying for whatever time they can get on and all the rest of it.
So for you, what's the best, in terms of presentation, dissemination of your work, what would you consider to be?
I think everyone has to kind of have a, well, I think that the crucial issue for me is not about the means, but about the audience. It's about the relationship with the audience and agency. What is, and I don't mean the agency of the photographer or the artist, but the agency of the audience.
Well, somebody who thinks a lot about audiences is one contributor. Sorry. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question on a different topic, which is the relationship of image to text. And I think historically documentary has always been associated with text, captions, articles, etc. And I think, for example, Steffi, I know, mentioned that she has a text that accompanies her work that we saw yesterday. And I think that knowing that text, reading that text might radically change my perception of that work, or it may just act as a garnish. And I'd like to ask maybe, Faye, and maybe Juan, at what point does the imagery really sort of stand alone, and at what point do you rely on text to further the meanings and the richness of what you want the audience to?
Regarding what we were discussing before, I do believe that all institutional platforms to distribute work are valid. It's depending on the nature of the project, the nature of the work that we are doing. According to that nature, internet will be wonderful, or the web will be awesome. It's depending. I come from advertising and from communication studies, and I am very aware of the importance of the channel through which we diffuse our messages. Remember the famous Ablucha sentence. And I would like to add something. As an educator, I think that we don't insist enough to our students that the artwork is never self-referential. I don't believe in autonomous artworks. Any artwork depends on a specific context, social, cultural, historical, political, and so on. Any specific artwork has a target, has an audience. It's not the same a picture in a gallery than the picture printed in a newspaper, or the same picture diffused to the web. The characteristics of the medium will change dramatically the content, the meaning, the power of that image. So it happened often to me that young photographers just produce images, but they don't know what are they going to do with them. They don't have a specific plan, they don't have a strategy to communicate, to position those images in a real context. Because probably they are obsessed with the art stage, with the artist, with the white kid, and just like, for example, yeah, it might be a wonderful place, but not always. For instance, in my own situation, I balance. I try to do actions are the main, the more valid situation for me to develop my work. But then it should be documented and presented in the museum. But that's not the work, that's not the actual performance. It's a documentation of what I did somewhere else. I mean that I need two steps. The museum can legitimate and validate and present it as a document to be known and studied. But actually, my photographs don't have any sense if previously haven't reached my public, my target, in the situation I have conceived for. And for instance, text was in my own case, this is very important. The same reason. I mean, I don't understand photographs alone, photographs autonomous. Photographs interact with text, interact with architecture, interact with, many things. I wouldn't do the same exhibition, exactly the same in two different places because visitors will be different. They will talk different, they will feel different, they will look at the pictures different. So I try to know. I mean, I probably learned that in advertising, that I must to know who I'm speaking to in order to properly communicate the message. So I try to take advantage of all the peripheral relationships photography can handle with other media. I'm not a purist. I love videotape, I love writing, I love using vitrines or showcases or whatever. If this could implement the idea, if this could assist the impact of the project, then that.
But your question is very relevant because, of course, traditionally fine art practice and practitioners using the medium recently have decided not to title things or leave them untitled. I'll just go to ask Nicholas or Faye whether they'd like to add anything, speaking from that perspective. Just to back up what Ryan said earlier, but it kind of depends. I mean, where I've done interventionist work in museums and so on, it's very important not only not to have text, but quite often to make work anonymously as well. But there is a problem with that, especially if you're not that established and you're not that discussed yet, but that work does kind of disappear. But having said that, within other contexts, I mean, perhaps instead of text, I'd say what's very useful is dialogue, and however you can do that, sometimes it is through text, sometimes through methods. But I do title work. I think untitled is a very frustrating title, and I try to avoid it because it just in terms of encouraging a sort of mode of interpretation and a possibility of intentionality to happen, it's very useful because otherwise the audience might not see just enough clues. I mean, that's the balance, isn't it? Seeing enough clues of how to read it and how to place it without the whole game being spoiled. So it's a balancing act, and it depends on the work and depends on the context. You do title the work, don't you?
Yes,
the prediction.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know what this is. Yeah. Nothing important, but yeah, I agree. I'm very bad title. And my works, until now, have been so that they wouldn't need this extra sort. And I mostly it has been kind of garnishing or
And they're very important to this work.
Yeah.
They position it very clearly.
Yes. Well, and also text. As I think some, David Campany was saying yesterday. The big, one of the sort of grounds that realism was built on was the relationship between text and images. A great example of this is the famous picture of Robert Capa's Falling Soldier in Spain, of which there was just like a furious controversy about at one point. But if you ever look at the original publication of that photograph, many, so many people have seen it reproduced in photo books and all kinds of galleries and all sorts of things. If you look at the original repro of that picture in 1936, published in Life magazine, which was having to deal with the kind of radicalism in the American labour movement at the time, there was an extensive caption under it, which is like kind of a sort of history lesson written by someone who's schooled in historical materialism about the Spanish bourgeoisie and the Catholic Church. You never know from its kind of reproduction in various Magnum editions and all the rest of it, that this picture was tied to 10 lines of incredibly concise lines about the conflict in Spain. That was the basis for realism. So, I mean, my work, I think, like Rana, what you do in a gallery is one thing. What you do elsewhere is actually, you've always got to, the real work is somewhere else. And whatever you do in a gallery is really just to help you do the real work.
Shall we just change the topic of conversation? We have a question up there.
Yes, I'm just thinking, earlier on today, I know Russell isn't here now, but he did talk about, I think, in relation to Susan Marceli's work, he mentioned that there was artistry in its intellectual coherence, which I thought was rather interesting. I'd just like to ask Hito whether there's anything there in relation to what she just said about the tear gas dissolving. She asked us to imagine this, the tear gas dissolving between buildings, and she suggested there was no experience or meaning in that. But if there's artistry, intellectual coherence, then I would say that there's a lot of meaning in that image, even though we didn't see everything.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't really answer that question because I wasn't there during Russell's talk.
It was in particular relation to what you said. I think maybe if I heard this wrong, I don't know, but there's no experience or meaning in that image.
Yes, this is a quote by Abound, and this is what he's trying to tell us, that there was no experience during this tear cloud when it was dissolving. I'm not so sure. I don't know. I mean, actually, I'm at a complete loss concerning this question. Where is experience, especially in documentary perception? When does it happen? Does it happen, or is all we see some sort of substitute for real experience? I think the experience of the spectator is a particular one because we are at once compelled to believe that we are participating in some real events, and at the same time, I mean, it's obvious that this is not the case, but this is some sort of in-between sensation, experience, I don't know we're having, and I'm quite interested in exploring that. I have no clear answer for this question.
Well, for me, I think the experience would be in the intellectual level, perhaps, and there's artistry in that. I think that's what Russell was trying to say. I did appreciate very much what Owen was talking about earlier, because I think those things join up in what Owen was describing for us.
Sorry, let's try it. Sorry, just come back on that.
I think I was joining up with trying to remind everyone what Ross was saying about. He said there is artistry in the intellectual coherence of a piece of work, even though it may not be a piece of art. He was relating it to Susan Marceli's work, I think. And I was just saying, I think what Owen was saying I found very rich indeed, because it did contextualise, it did ground a lot of those issues in terms of experience and our intellectual experience of what's being portrayed, whether it's art or not.
That's why when I was having my spiel, I was talking about Hegel and the social whole, and the whole history of that big chunk of philosophy, which is very important because Adam Smith came up against a kind of, the capitalists love to call Adam Smith, they sort of bastardise the wealth of nations, really. we've got the Adam Smith Institute in London, which has now been given loads of money for projecting neoliberalism onto the third world. But it's really a kind of their use of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is really very partial. But anyway, I mean, Adam Smith and his philosophy came up against a problem of epistemology, which he covered over with what he called general rules. And this problem was taken up by Kant, who's born virtually the same, I think within a few years of when Kant and Smith were born within years of one another, and Hegel, and led inevitably to Marx and historical materialism, and on to Adorno and negative dialectics and the rest of it. Anyway, there's a whole philosophy which is really about the reflexivity of knowledge, and what I think is that I think it's Joanne was talking about when he did this project where you worked with a historian and you authenticated all this. You had really good sort of gold star knowledge, but everyone thought it was fake. If I'm not overplaying that, but I thought that was quite funny. But you know, the difficulty of being a photographer and all of this is that you have to work collaboratively, and you have to be aware of methodology. That's the whole, you know, otherwise it's just all, you know, just say whatever you like. It's what I'm trying to talk about in disinterpretation. Artists are performing a disinterpretation, which just comes from the marketplace. It's not, you know, David Irving was just thrown into jail because he took disinterpretation a bit too far. But, you know, disinterpretation is the order of the market. I thought Joanne's showing postcards where you can move the mountain across and all the rest of it. You know, that is the subversion of capitalism, and unless artists and photographers equip themselves somehow to fight that, and do fight for truth value, which is not something that the camera will give you. Truth value is something that you can only get from critical knowledge. The rest is the technical stuff, you know, which really, you know, you're never going to resolve those technical issues about indexicality and all the rest of it. You never. It's just a circular discussion. And we can have endless conferences about them forever. Meanwhile, the world will be going on and getting worse and worse unless people attend to these problems. Which, you know, yeah.
No, you're completely right. This was also an impression I had today during this conference, which you also mentioned, that it was sort of strange that after a really long time, there's still this anxiety, you know, with truth, with faith, veracity, and so on, and that there is indeed, you know, this circular movement, which seems also very often like a dead end, you know, this anxiety. Is it real? Is it a fake? Oh, it was a fake, but then it becomes real, and so on. But in a sense, I believe that this is probably precisely the definition of the documentary today. It is this anxiety, you know, it triggers this anxiety, and it's not defined by, you know, a certain indexical relationship to the real or certain production mode. It is defined by this sort of anxiety. And to come back to your comment, which is very enlightening in this regard, I think that maybe the intellectual experience you are describing is precisely trying to unravel and work through this anxiety, and also to reflect it in aesthetic terms. You know, at the moment there's not much more we can do about it, since this also is a symptom, a condensation of the present political situation. This anxiety. I mean, there's no certain there's no sudden miracle which could happen through any sort of sudden intellectual revelation we have about documentary, but to work through this anxiety is, I think, the intellectual experience which can be gained at the moment.
Can I just ask Mina to talk about the institute documentary?
Yeah, because I also would completely agree with what was just said. And I sometimes think, that's why I'm in a way stuck to this very old discussion, because I think this old discussion is part of the system. Whenever a medium comes to the speaker, people can use it to proceed. There's a big effort to convince them that this medium, nobody can trust this medium, and so on. So this kind of only state websites like .gov websites are really to rely, and they are really true. I mean, they would never come up with any fake which is completely rubbish. I mean, best fake is always done by this kind of American government media, but I think this is a kind of really a political, and I'm outraged how much this is mirrored into academic conference, not like this one, but into academic theory against, I mean, what are media theorists, intellectuals doing in raising and in increasing these anxieties. Don't use it, and don't do only trust official stuff, not the stuff that comes from the local media group around the corner, but because they're not professional, because they do fake, and so on. So I think this is easier also for this web context too.
Are there any more questions? Just because we have to finish now, I think 6 o'clock. Are there any more questions for the floor, for the panel, from the floor? No, I think you're all exhausted. You've been here for 2 days, longer than me. So thank you very much, and thank you to Callus, thank you to Andrew Lang, Helen Sio,